Well, good evening, everybody. I hope you're having a good February so far. I'm at my house about an hour from Bozeman. It's snowing hard, and Jackie says she's in the office in Bozeman, and she said it's snowing hard there too. So we're getting our good share of winter. I know some of you have been in polar vortex land, and so hope that you're staying warm. Certainly, if we think, Jackie and I think we have our technical difficulties handled. But if you have some issues, if you can't see the screen or you can't hear me, I don't know what you would do then. But anywho, if you want to send a chat or write in the questions pane, Jackie will be monitoring that for me, and she can let me know if we're having any technical difficulty. So this evening, we thought we might want to come back and revisit a little bit or just have some discussion about the selection indexes that you guys created as your assignment from last month's webinar. And I think that we really enjoyed I enjoyed reading them. They were great. So we'll start there. We'll talk a little bit about your selection index homework and some things that some common themes and some things that were different from all of you because you're from all over the country. And then we'll kind of switch in and we'll talk a little bit about nutrition. And so this is my gig. This is my wheelhouse. This is my training is as a ruminant nutritionist. And so we'll talk about ruminant GI tract anatomy and function, so the special cool awesomeness of ruminant animals like cattle. And then we'll have a quick overview of nutrients and requirements and kind of geared a little bit towards your feedlot steers. And then we'll just take a quick look near the end at some feed intake records. So we'll as you know, your calves are in those grow safe units, and so they're having those daily intakes measured. And so I've gone into some of that data, and I have an example pen of calves that we're going to look at here at the end. And so we'll take a sample from your steers, and we'll talk a little bit about the ins and outs of intake and how it kind of all works. And then, of course, as always, we'll have time for questions and discussion. And so if you have questions as we go along, certainly Jackie's going to monitor that for me. So we should be in good shape. So before we get any farther, Jackie, do we have anything, or are we in good shape?
I have not seen any questions, and I shot out a chat just in case they can't hear you to let them know to send us a chat if they have any problems. So
great,
we're all set.
Okay, thank you. All right. So overall, great job on the selection index homework. I so enjoyed reading all of your ideas and your thoughts. I learned so much about all your different operations and where you live and how that impacted your decisions. And so those regional differences were really highlighted. I've got, there's a group of you from Missouri. I heard a lot from that group about fescue tolerance and importance of that region and how we want to make sure that the cattle can do well on those, endophyte infected fescue pastures and what that means. I've got some of you from high altitude and high elevation ranches in Colorado, and you told me important things about PAP score, so pulmonary arterial pressure, and so you're concerned about whether or not a bull's progeny are going to be able to survive at that high altitude without high altitude disease or brisket disease. So that was super cool. It was really fun to learn about how those regional differences are important. And I think it really highlights and underlines that the cow-calf industry and the beef cattle industry in the U.S. is so diverse because of that very region. And so our competing proteins like pork and chicken have a different environment because they build their environment for their animals much more than we do. Mother Nature builds our environments, and so those regional differences really underlined how we're varied across the whole country. Overall, I thought you all did an awesome job. You have great written communication skills based, on your age, and I took that into account. when I was kind of going through the rubric. And so hopefully you've all received that email with the rubric. If you haven't, email the spc@simgene.com email and let me know, and I'll make sure that we get that back to you. Great job. There are some of you out in SPC land who are, you know, in the upper junior and lower intermediate division of AJSA who are writing as well or better than some of the college students I used to teach. And so good job. Keep up the good work. I really enjoyed that. So some common traits, things that were common that many of you told me. Probably the most common trait that you used in your custom selection index that you created was calving ease. By and large, most everybody was talking about calving ease direct, but there were a few of you who were also mentioned calving ease maternal, and the importance of having you know, say a bull's first calf heifers be able to calve well and easily on their own as well. A lot of you have other things, or your families have other jobs besides raising cattle, and so calving ease was important to you because you aren't living on farm or on ranch or working on farm on ranch every day. So calving ease was important for many of you. And then we had some more variation depending on what your kind of final market was. So there's quite a few of you who were telling me that you're going to, you know, sell calves at weaning, and so weaning weight was important. And there are others of you who might retain some ownership on some calves, and so you were concerned some with carcass traits, and so carcass weight and marbling, a few ribeye area out there in the mix, but you guys were wanting to make sure, and even those of you who were selling calves at weaning, you did a great job of realizing that weaning weight is super important for your bottom line, but unless you have adequate carcass traits, then those buyers probably aren't going to come back next year and want to buy your calves again if they have poor carcass traits. So great job there. And then had some good discussion throughout about maternal traits. Milk production, milk EPD, probably the most common maternal trait besides calving ease, maternal that was mentioned. A few of you talked about stayability. Had great appreciation for that, of course. And then some in this kind of can relate to stayability, but some of you talked a lot about structure. Totally love it. Agree 100%. Certainly, it's a harder thing to measure, but certainly we have foot scores coming on into the industry, and udder scores as well. And so I heard quite a bit about bad feet and bad bags and how you don't want them, and I think that's awesome as well. And then docility was a big one. Appreciate that, of course, as well. A lot of some of you talked about how if you're some of you have some cattle that you want to show. And that was part of your description of your index, and so docility was important to a lot of you, both those who are from the show ring purposes and just from regular dealing with cows on a regular basis, not wanting to get run over purposes. And so I really appreciated that. And so, again, great job. Hopefully the rubrics that I wrote were helpful. Provide you some suggestions. If you have questions on any of that, please don't hesitate. Go ahead and email the SPC email and let me know. So bravo, well done. Really enjoyed reading what you guys had to say. All right, so now we'll switch gears here and we'll talk a little bit of feedlot nutrition. So as you probably all know, beef cattle are ruminants. So often you might hear that beef cattle described as having 4 stomachs. Actually, they just have 1 stomach, but it has 4 very different compartments. Okay, and so those are kind of depicted here. So you can see we've got the esophagus coming down from the mouth, down the neck here, into a big, large rumen reticulum combination. Okay, and so the reticulum is kind of that first compartment. So as feed comes in, so cattle are going to be grazing and they're going to have what's called a bolus. And so they'll have a bolus of feed, a mouthful of feed. And so with things like with more hay or with grazing, then a lot of saliva is going to be used here to make those boluses. It's not as relative in the feedlot when we have kind of a more uniform diet that's kind of all the same size, and those mouthfuls are a little bit different, but nonetheless, those boluses, those mouthfuls, drop into the reticulum. And then the rumen is the largest compartment. And as you can see, it kind of goes from, the back down to the belly and from the shoulder back to the hip. And so it's taking up the main middle kind of this animal. And so a full-grown cow, if you were to empty out all of the contents in the rumen, you would easily fill up a big 55-gallon garbage can. Okay, there's a huge capacity in there for feed. And another cool thing about ruminants is that they're not alone out there. So they have millions and millions and millions of teeny tiny microorganisms that live in that rumen that allow them to break down feeds like grass that have a lot of cellulose. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the nutrients section. But those bugs, those microorganisms in the rumen, allow ruminant animals like cows and sheep and deer and elk and moose to eat feeds that those of us with simple stomachs like pigs and us humans, we just can't do a good job of digesting those feeds because we aren't set up the same way with that rumen microorganism group of helpers in our gastrointestinal tract. So then the other two compartments are the omasum, which is next in line, and the abomasum. And so as feed gets digested in the rumen, now, of course, as you all know, another important component of a ruminant animal is that they regurgitate those boluses, those bites that they have taken before, and they chew their cud, right? And so some of this stems back to the idea that a beef cattle animal or a ruminant animal, they're generally going to be prey animals, not predators, right? So they're going to be on the lookout. So over time, they evolved as prey animals to go out and when they feel safe and eat large amounts and not chew the food very well. Okay, so think about a grazing cow. She's going to get up in the morning and she's going to go out and have what we call a grazing bout. She's going to walk through that pasture and she's going to eat, but she's going to take, a few bites and kind of chew it a little bit, have lots of saliva, make that bolus, and then when she feels like she's full, she's going to go find a nice spot. And if it's in the summer, she's going to go find a place that's nice and shady, get some drink of water, and lay down where she feels safe and comfortable, and she's going to chew her cud. And so then she'll start the work of breaking down that feed into smaller particles when she goes ahead and regurgitates those boluses to rechew them and make those particle sizes smaller. That helps the rumen microorganisms then get access and break down that feed so that the animal can use the nutrients from that forage, for example. In the omasum, then, once feed is small enough particle size, it's going to flow into the omasum. And the omasum is important because it helps draw back and pull back a lot of water from that feed. And so that's a way that the animal almost recycles water back into the system. And then the fourth compartment is the abomasum. And so the abomasum of a cow is just like a human's stomach or a pig's stomach, for example. And so, but the big difference here is that those other three compartments are needed in order to process the feed into a form that can be further digested in the abomasum and then absorbed in the small intestine like a monogastric or a simple stomached animal would. So again, the four compartments of the ruminant stomach are the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum, and the abomasum. And so I'll show you a little bit about each compartment. Okay, so this is a picture of the wall of the rumen the inside wall of the rumen of a cow. And so there you can see that we have these little projections, right? These little fingers that stick out into the middle part of what we call the lumen. Okay, and so these particles really increase the amount of surface that is used to absorb nutrients. Okay, and so papillae form as an animal grows, and so as a baby calf starts to eat more solid food, mixed in with their milk, then you're going to see these papillae start to form and grow. And so the reticulum on the left here is often called the honeycomb stomach, so you can see probably why that is. And so these are papillae, just like we saw in the previous slide, but the papillae in the reticulum are fused into this honeycomb structure. And so it's really tough and can stand up to a lot of wear and tear. And so if, say, a cow is grazing along and they pick up a rock, it's going to probably fall because it's heavy into the reticulum, and often those items will stay in the reticulum, and if they go into the rumen, they'll stay in the bottom and not cause issues because they're heavy with going farther down the gastrointestinal tract and causing problems. Now, one thing, though, that we do know that can happen is if you've ever heard of hardware disease. So, for example, if an animal picks up a piece of wire, and so then it would fall into the reticulum, and if the wire is sharp, say on the end, and it were to poke a hole through the reticulum, then you might see an animal start to really lose weight, look like that they're having a hard time breathing, looks like it hurts when they move, and often that's because we've got that puncture in the reticulum, and so we have some issues with how that animal is able to move. It hurts when they move because of that wire, for example, but that's generally the place. So you might, if those of you are familiar with, if you have some dairymen in your area, it's not uncommon for dairies to put a magnet down. So like if you were to give a big pill with a big bolus gun, you would give a magnet, and then it's heavy, it hangs out in the reticulum, and then if those dairy cows eat anything metal, then it can stick to that magnet and hopefully cause little damage. So then on the right hand side here we have the omasum. And so the omasum is often talked about as pages in a book. And so you can kind of see how it's opened up. And so you can see again, so all of these folds help with that whole idea of reabsorbing water as it's flowing down through the gastrointestinal tract. So I told you a little bit about these really cool microorganisms that are in the rumen. Okay, and so there's 3 different broad categories, and so the first 2 are here. So there's bacteria and fungi. Okay, so on the left-hand side, we've got rumen bacteria that's magnified by 14,000 times. Okay, so we need pretty fancy equipment. So just a regular microscope like you might have in your science lab at school is not going to cut it when it comes to seeing rumen bacteria under it. So if you were to take a drop of rumen fluid and put it on a slide, you would not be able to see the bacteria. They're too small for just a regular light microscope. And then, so you can see over here on the right-hand side, you've got some fungi, okay, at 3,000. Okay, and so you can see they kind of have these weird tentacles that they're called hyphae, and those hyphae then help them attach to feed particles and break those feed particles down. And then these, on this slide, are Rumen Protozoa. Now, if you were to take a drop of rumen fluid and put it on a regular microscope, you would totally be able to see these, and it's way cool. If you ever have an opportunity to do so, do it. It's super fun. And so these guys are just magnified by 100. Okay, and so there's several different kinds here you can see. And so the one up on the top that's kind of a darker blob, he has kind of little hair-like projections that stick out all over his body. Those are called cilia. And so if this were moving and you could watch them move, that's how that particular protozoa swims around and moves. And so if you're looking at rumen fluid under a microscope, you're going to see these guys zooming in and out and across the field of view. They're going to be doing lots of moving. Now, protozoa are interesting creatures because they also, some of them help break down feed, but some of them also hang out and eat the bacteria who are also helping. So it's quite kind of a jungle in there in that room, and there's lots of stuff going on and interactions among the microorganisms as well as between the microorganisms and the host animal. So you might be wondering, well, what's in it for each of these critters? Okay, and so the ruminant host, okay, so the cow or the sheep or the deer, and the microbes have what's called a symbiotic relationship. Okay, and a symbiotic relationship, both parties benefit. Now, with a parasitic relationship, that's not the case, right? So parasites would live on the host animal and usually cause the host animal some sort of harm. But symbiotic relationships now, both parties benefit. So both the ruminant host and the microbes benefit. And so here's kind of just a little overview of how that really all goes down and how it works. So the rumen provides an ideal environment for the microbes, okay? And the microbes, these microbes are gonna like something that's warm, pretty constant temperature, right? So temperature of a beef cattle is 101.5 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and there's not going to be a lot of fluctuation. You know, it might fluctuate a few degrees when she takes a big drink of cold water. Okay, not a lot of difference in there. They like it moist, lots of water, lots of a moist environment. They get that, and they also like it where there's no oxygen. Okay, so unlike us, we're what's called aerobic animals. Okay, so animals that breathe oxygen are aerobic. Animals that don't breathe oxygen or that are harmed by oxygen are called anaerobes. They're anaerobic. And so the rumen is an anaerobic environment where oxygen is not. And so that's an ideal spot for these microbes. Now, what does the ruminant get? Well, the ruminant has the ability then to break down feedstuffs that simple stomached animals can't. Okay, so microbes break down the feed, and what they're doing is supporting their growth. So the microbes are breaking down the feed using the byproducts from the feed to grow themselves, the microbes, okay? And so in addition to the nutrients that the animal is able to use and absorb from the broken down feed that the microbes, after the microbes have broken it down, the microbes themselves, okay, the microbe waste products, okay, provide nutrients to the host animal. And so those are going to be primarily in the form of energy, protein, and vitamins. So all these microbes are hanging out, they're breaking down feed. And so one of the main pieces of product that they produce from breaking this down are called volatile fatty acids, or VFAs, okay? And those are the main energy source for a ruminant animal. Okay, and then let's see, what's next here? Protein then, so not only will there be protein from the breakdown of the feeds, but there's also going to be the microbes themselves are about 50% protein. So after a microbe has lived its short life and has broken down feed, and it's going to flow out of the rumen with the feed, and then in the small intestine it will be broken down and absorbed as protein. And so microbes are about half protein, and so that's a great protein source for a ruminant animal. And then microbes, some of the microbes actually make vitamins, and so that's another source, vitamin source for a ruminant animal. So we'll talk a brief review of the 6 classes of nutrients. So if you have hopefully read through your newsletter from this month, I talked about that as well. And so this is the 6 classes. Okay, we've got water, carbohydrates, and fats, and those 2 categories are energy sources, protein, vitamins, and minerals. So we'll go through each of these in kind of a brief skimmed overview of the importance, okay? So water is going to be super important for almost everything, right? Digestion, nutrient transport. So without water, we wouldn't be able to have nutrients transported around the body for where they need to be used. Excretion of wastes, okay? Temperature regulation. Water really helps an animal or a human maintain that constant body temperature. And so certainly water quality is important. We know that animals who have to drink poor quality water are not going to perform as well. And so that's always, as you all know, a critical piece of animal nutrition. So carbohydrates, okay, the simplest form of carbohydrates are just single sugar molecules that might have 5 or 6 carbons. Okay, and then those are often hooked together, 6 carbon sugars, and make longer strands. And so starch and cellulose are 2 examples. And so when we have just one of those sugar molecules, it's called a monosaccharide. So mono meaning one, and then saccharide meaning the sugar containing piece. When we have lots of those sugar molecules hooked together, then they're called polysaccharides. So poly means many, and again, our saccharides are dealing with the sugar molecules. And so starch and cellulose are the 2 polysaccharides that we're going to find in the highest concentration in any plant. So if we look at a corn plant, or we look at corn grain, or we look at some alfalfa hay, starch or cellulose are going to be the highest components of polysaccharides in those plants. And so there's a couple of differences. One difference is that starch can be broken down by animals themselves, but cellulose cannot. So cellulose needs those microorganisms to help break down the carbon or the sugar chains. Okay, and so the difference here is basically in how those sugars are bonded together. So you can see down here in this little picture, we've got amylose or starch on the top picture, and then we've got cellulose on the bottom picture. And so you can see those, each little sugar molecule is the little 6-sided figure. And so you can see that they're bonded just differently. So the only difference is in how the glucose molecules, those 6 carbon sugars, are bound together in starch versus cellulose. Okay, so fats are going to be a concentrated form of stored energy, and it's so concentrated, in fact, that if we were to take a gram or an ounce or a pound of fat, and we were going to compare its energy value with the same amount, say a pound of carbohydrate or a pound of protein, fats have 2.25 times more energy than carbohydrates or protein do. So it's a really, really energy dense, and so that's hence the concentrated form of stored energy. So it's an important piece of the puzzle. Often then, if animals are eating excess energy, they'll be storing that as fat. Certainly your steers are starting to get into that mode as they are putting on a lot of muscle, and now as we get closer to the end are going to be putting on more fat as they get finished. Fats can be liquid or solid, so think about canola oil that you might have in your kitchen, for example, as that would be a liquid form of fat. Okay, and so then certainly butter is a solid that has high fat content as well. So now proteins. Proteins are probably going to be they're going to be the next in line. Most water is going to be the nutrient in highest concentration in the body of an animal, and then followed by protein. And proteins are going to be involved, just like water was vital for so many different activities, so is protein. Okay, so proteins protect the body. Okay, so your hair and your skin both are high protein. Okay, proteins can help digest feed and so a lot of enzymes, cofactors that are going to help in the breakdown of feed are going to be proteins. They help metabolize nutrients in cells via enzyme use. Proteins can stimulate growth So some hormones that help stimulate growth, for example, bovine somatotropin or growth hormone is a protein. Proteins are hugely important in the immune system. So we have these big, giant protein blobby proteins called immunoglobulins. Okay, and they're really, really important for immune system. Immunoglobulins are a huge component of colostrum, or the first milk that a cow makes. That's really, really important for setting up the immune system in baby calves because they really don't have one when they're born. And then how about minerals? Okay, so now we're going to get into things that are needed in tiny amounts, but are really, really, really important. Okay, so minerals are inorganic. Okay, now when I'm talking organic in our nutrition lecture here, we're not talking about organic food. We're talking about chemistry. So inorganic means it doesn't contain any carbon. Organic, on the other hand, means there's some carbon. So minerals contain no carbon. They're inorganic. They're solid. They're usually crystalline. And they're elements that you can't make or break down by chemical reactions. Minerals are going to be classified in animal nutrition based on their concentration in the animal body. So major or macro minerals are going to be found at a concentration greater than 100 parts per million. Okay, so 100 parts per million parts. While trace or micro minerals are going to be found in concentrations less than 100 parts per million. So minerals, like proteins and water, have many functions. So minerals are going to be important components of bone, muscle, and milk. Minerals are often a cofactor for enzyme activity. Hemoglobin, which is really important in carrying oxygenated blood, so it's a huge component of red blood cells, carries oxygen through the blood to parts of the rest of the body. Has iron as the mineral iron as an important component. Myoglobin is another important factor in meat color, for example, also has minerals. Vitamin B12 has cobalt as an important component. Thyroid hormone, iodine, is going to be really important in the thyroid. And then minerals are hugely important in our nervous system. So anything we do from as far as thinking and synapses that work in our brain, and our brain sending messages to us that we need to move, really important. Osmotic pressure and pH as well. So certainly minerals aren't needed in as large a quantity as energy, for example, but certainly without them or with a deficiency, we have a pretty big issue. Now vitamins, unlike minerals, are organic compounds. Okay, so vitamins are going to have a carbon component somewhere, and they're required by tissues in really, really small amounts. Okay. Now, some animals can synthesize vitamins, different vitamins in their tissues, and or they can use those that are made by the microbes in their gastrointestinal tract. Okay, ruminants are pretty lucky because they're going to have a lot of their vitamin needs met by the rumen microbial action. And so vitamins are kind of classified in two different categories, whether they're called water soluble or fat soluble. So basically this means water soluble vitamins would be ones that you could put in water and they would dissolve. Fat soluble vitamins do not. Okay, so vitamin C and all of the B complex vitamins are water soluble. On the other hand, A, D, E, and K, ADEC is a good way to remember it, are fat soluble vitamins. All right, so we'll talk just a bit about some of the ingredients that your steers have been eating. And so some of the dietary ingredients that they've been using at the University of Missouri include sorghum baleage, soy hulls, brome hay, corn, dried distillers grains with solubles, an amino acid supplement called Amino Plus. So that's amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Okay, and then some other supplement that's probably going to contain vitamins, minerals, and protein. And so at Mizzou, they've got 3 different levels. So when the calves first got there, they got a receiving supplement, then a growing supplement, and then finally they'll get a finishing supplement. So right now, steers are the baleage and the soy hulls were part of the receiving diet. So your calves are past that, so they're in kind of a growing finishing stage right now. So the diet right now does not contain the baleage or the hulls, but does have brome hay, corn, distillers, and then these 2 supplements here at the bottom. Okay. Now, dry distillers, grains of solubles, depending on what part of the country you're from, you may or may not be familiar with those. So by and large, distillers, the largest component where we've moved a lot to getting them would be as a byproduct of the ethanol industry. So when we send corn into the ethanol plant to make ethanol, certainly not all of the corn kernel is going to be used. And so there's going to be a byproduct, and that particular byproduct is distillers grains with solubles. And so this is going to be a high energy and a fairly high protein feed. In fact, it's high enough energy that you can often substitute it for corn in diets. So we're talking, and it also, because a lot of the energy was used to make the ethanol, it has a higher concentration of fat than, say, the corn parent product would have. So distillers grains are often a very useful diet ingredient, and so that's another cool thing. A lot of the feedstuffs that we can feed to cattle are often the byproducts of another industry, and so soy hulls would be another example of that from the soybean industry. All right, so we're kind of, here's just a simple graph that kind of shows you how animal tissue growth, or even humans, would happen over time. Okay, so we've got we're going to think about this from a beef cattle perspective. Okay, so on the vertical or y-axis, you have growth units. Okay, so this could be, say, pounds. And then on the horizontal or x-axis, you have time units. Okay, so this is as time is going by. Okay, so the lines start at birth. Okay, and we're going to end here close at maturity. Okay, or finish. So you can see that bone growth happens early in life. Okay, but over time we get all of the bone growth that's going to happen, right? And that levels off in the black line. So bone growth happens early in life, and then we're done. Then we have muscle growth, and that's happening at a pretty rapid pace throughout an animal's early life, and then starts to taper off or flatten out, okay, as we reach maturity. And then fat, we're also, as an animal is putting on muscle, it's also putting on fat, but certainly the muscle takes priority through early life, and so we don't really get that increase in fat until we have laid down a lot of that mature muscle. And so this is kind of, and you can substitute finish for maturity and think about this as how your steers are growing. So your steer's bone growth is pretty close to done, right? They're putting on a lot of muscle right now, and as they get closer to being ready for harvest, that's when we're going to see this increase in fat deposition. While we're talking about this, Chip did get some info to me today. The steers average about 1050 right now, 1,050 pounds, and their average for last month was 3.94 pounds per day. Now that's down from the dang near 6 that they were hitting the month before, but they had a pretty big snow event with some cold, and so again, not a huge surprise. They kind of expected that based on the weather, but that's still pretty dang good. So your calves are doing well, and there was no sickness at all. Everyone's very healthy. So even though they had that weather, calves are doing great. Nobody needed to be doctored. So something to keep in mind too, as your cattle are going to get closer to finish, hopefully I've convinced you from the previous slide that fat deposition is going to increase and protein deposition is going to slow. Okay, so they're going to reach that maximum protein or muscle, and we're going to have an increase in fat. It takes more energy to put down a pound of fat gain than a pound of protein gain or a pound of muscle gain. So it's not unexpected. Certainly, I think we'll probably have some increased gains. I would expect if weather stays pretty decent, those calves are going to bounce back. But from the long term, over time, as animals put on more fat, efficiency of feed conversion decreases, right? So it's going to take more pounds of feed for the same amount of gain, as the gain is composed more of fat than of muscle. So here's just kind of an idea what nutrient requirements kind of are going to look like. So we've got increasing cattle weight from about 770 up to 1120. Your steers are already here at this 1050 at the next last spot I've got here on this graph. Crude protein is in green, and so that's their protein requirement in pounds per day. Okay, so you can see that it's pretty steady. There's a slight decrease as they continue to grow. And then in the orange color is TDN, or energy. Okay, so this is total digestible nutrients. That's a measure of energy. You can see energy requirements are increasing. Then we've got dry matter intake. So that's with all of the water dried out of the feed, how many pounds of dry feed an animal. So this, I think, is not surprising to you that as an animal ages and gets bigger, they eat more. And so you're seeing the effects of that here. All right, now let's talk turkey. So we'll talk about intake now. So this shows the November feed intake for the entire group of steers. Okay, and so if we look at the orange colored line that's straight, that's the if we average all of the steers intake for the whole month. So we take every day, every steer, and divide by the denominator to get us how many pounds did these steers eat each day. That's the orange line. Then if we look at the November daily average, that's the blue line. Okay, so then that's saying on November 18th, these 52 steers averaged this many pounds. Okay, and so you can see over time that changes, right? So something to keep in mind that we do in the beef cattle industry, always, 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 not just in nutrition, is we manage for the average, right? So we're going to say, if we were going to describe this group of calves, we would say that, you know, they're averaging about 18.5 pounds of feed intake per day. But you can see that when they first came into the feedlot, it was quite a bit lower. Okay, that's not unusual. We would expect that. They're getting used to a new place. They're learning how to eat out of those crazy grow safe bunks. And so we can see that if we look at the trend, yeah, these steers are growing. They're really taking off here. Around Thanksgiving time, they're really doing a great job, eating a lot more. We have an increase. So this is the average for November. Okay, so this is all the steers. And then if we look at December, we start to see a little more interesting pattern. So the December monthly average for feed intake is between 25 and 30, I think, or somewhere in the 26.8, 27 pounds region here. Okay, and then, but you can see daily that we have kind of some bouncing around of that. And so when we think about how we're going to manage, we're going to provide a certain amount of feed to an animal, right? So if you're going to feed a steer for your county fair, your state fair, and you're feeding him by himself, you're going to say, all right, I'm going to feed him 20 pounds of corn today. And we feed him 20 pounds every day. But you can see here that if we let an animal kind of eat however much they want to every day, it's not going to always be the same, right? You can see there's daily variation here. Some days they're going to eat more. The next day they might eat less. So then I just decided that we would pick pin 106. So this, I think, is tags 8, 9, 10, and 11, if those are your steers. And so here's pen 106. Here's in November, pen 106 averaged just over 15 pounds a day of intake. Okay, so this is when the steers first got to Mizzou. Okay, and then we have tag number 11 right here in the blue line. Okay, so when he first got to the yard, he was not eating very many pounds at all. He ate just under a pound, or right at a pound the first day. Okay, and then we have lots of variation. Okay, so again, we manage for the average. We say these steers are eating 16 pounds a day, but you can see some days, tag 11 had over 30 pounds of feed consumed. And then some days right around that average of 15. Okay, this is going to get busier because there's 4 steers in this pen. I'm going to add the other 3. Okay, so now the black line, the horizontal straight line, is showing us the pen average. Okay, now we've got tags 8 in orange, 9 in scary purple color, 10 in green, and 11 is still in blue. Same blue as before. Okay, so you can see tag 9, he really didn't come to the bunk on the 14th of November. And so you might say, well, Rachel, was this because this calf was sick? And I would say if he was, he didn't have symptoms in which he showed that he needed to be doctored, because pen 106 has not received any medication throughout the feeding period. So it may be something else. Maybe he had a bellyache that day. But you can see that the daily pattern of intake is not very straight line. Certainly from the 7th of November to the end. Not sure why we have this strange straight line here on 11:30. These calves increased over time in intake, which we would expect. So what about December? Well, let's look at this same group of calves in December. Now we're kind of starting to see a little bit closer pattern from calf to calf, and we see a big spike here. 2 of the calves had a big, the 16th of December was a big day to eat a lot. And that should say December pen average. So December pen average here is right at 25, 26 pounds. But there's lots of variation there when you let that animal eat to their appetite, what they want. There's actually quite a bit of, there's some cool feedlot research that actually looks at grow safe type systems like this, and that they can kind of monitor, and they've gone back and looked at, so say a calf is sick and does need doctored, if often when you go back and look at the daily intake records, you can see that calf dropped off up to 3 to 5 days before that event when they got sick. And so there's kind of an interest in thinking about how could, if this was in use, how could these daily intakes be used as a predictor or a way to monitor calves and say, hey, this calf hasn't come to the bunk for 3 days. He's not eating very much. Maybe we should see if he's ill, if he has a fever, maybe he needs to be doctored. So certainly the behavior of the animals can help predict and show us some interesting things about their health as well. All right, so the moment you've all been waiting for, I'm sure. What weird crap is Rachel going to give us to do in February? So here is your February feedback assignment. It's got 2 parts. First part, write a paragraph. So you don't have to write a lot, just a paragraph, about the most interesting thing you learned, what you thought was most interesting from this webinar. Even if you thought that I am the most boring person ever, make me feel good and tell me that there was at least one interesting thing you learned. And then when you're writing it, pretend that you're explaining this paragraph or this interesting thing to somebody with little to no cattle background. Okay, so I'm just going to, flex your muscles here. make you think a little bit about how would I explain what I found interesting to somebody who might not really have any background in the cattle industry or the cattle business. Second part, write another paragraph, but this one's going to be about yourself. So write a little introductory paragraph about yourself. We're going to have SPC spotlights in the upcoming SPC newsletters because we kind of realized that we don't do a good job of introducing you all to each other. So if you could send in a photo to go along with your intro, it can be a school picture, it can be a selfie, it can be a picture of you with your favorite cow. I don't care. So if you're willing, please do send in a photo to go along with your intro paragraph. So things to think about for what would you write? Where are you from? How old are you? What kind of, do you live on a farm? Do you live on a ranch? Do you live in town? Are your tell about your cattle, tell about your steers. Totally cool with about anything. So think about what you would like to learn about some of your peers and other SPC participants and write that. Okay, so 2 paragraphs, please. A paragraph about the most interesting thing you learned from the webinar that you're going to explain to someone with little to no cattle background. And another paragraph, second paragraph about you, introducing yourself, a little bit of background about you, and a picture. Okay, and as usual, that's going to be due via email. You can email it to the spc@simgene.com email a week from today, February 12th by 6 p.m. Mountain. And I'll go ahead and send out a rubric that will be a little, fairly similar to the rubric I sent out for last month via email tomorrow. So you can kind of see how I'm going to approach scoring those. So 2 paragraphs. They don't have to be long paragraphs. Tell me the information, and we'll be good to go there. So hopefully we've done a crash course here, talked about your selection index homeworks, which were awesome, and we've talked about some cool nutrition stuff. And so I would be happy, Jackie, if we have any questions, to take them. And then I'll be in touch with feed bills soon. So you guys have done a good job so far of keeping up on those. We really appreciate that. And we'll get to work on March's webinar here soon. So
if you have any questions, make sure to type them in the little question box or put them in the chat section, and we'll get you handled. Oh, got one coming in.
all right.
How do I get an individual daily feed intake chart for my steer?
Well, we could probably do one at the end of each month. So if you want one, email the SPC email and tell me so.
Okay, and then we had another one come in. How can we use the information on eating behaviors for show animals? Should we be feeding different amounts each day?
Good question. I think, you could. I think that would be how their natural behavior would be. I think that if we did do that from a show animal perspective, we might end up causing ourselves a little more trouble, because I think we might try to outthink the animal. And so I think it's probably hard to predict what the peaks and the valleys of that intake are going to look like. Like, I wouldn't know, let's look at this steer. How much do you think, if he was going to have a real day where he just ate to his heart's content all day long, how many pounds would it be? So I think managing to the average is probably going to continue to be our method from a show animal perspective. Certainly, if you feel like, depending on what you're doing and how, what kind of condition you want them to be in, and what you're feeding, sometimes you can provide them the concentrate portion, like the grain or the pellets portion, in the same amount each day, and then they might have the ability to eat, say, more free choice on hay, and so they might actually be exhibiting that behavior on other parts of their diet, but we might not know it because we might feed 3 calves this much, this half a bale a day kind of thing. So I think that the behavior piece, we might try to outsmart them a little too much if we were to try to predict it. But again, depending on how you're feeding or what you're feeding, those animals might already be exhibiting that behavior. You're just not measuring it.
Thanks, Rachel. We had another one come in as well.
Okay.
Do the bugs in the rumen eat the lining of the rumen too? Can that cause problems?
Ooh, good. Also awesome question. So, no, for the most part, the environment in the rumen is can be slightly acidic, but it is not high enough acid content or concentration to cause damage to the rumen in general regular diets. Now, if you do get some trouble where if you might try to step up steers on feed too fast, so they come in, they're receiving, and you're trying to get them up on grain and you push them too hard and too fast, we can get a lot of production, overproduction of acid in the rumen, and that's called acidosis. And so when we have animals with acidosis, sometimes then, yes, we can, because of that acidic high amount of acid, can damage the rumen lining. But no, for the most part, the microorganisms in the rumen are targeted on the feedstuffs themselves, so they're not going to be the kind of microorganisms or bacteria that might cause an infection. They're going to be different kinds of bacteria, good bacteria, and their main food source is going to be that feedstuff that animal's eating. Another thing that's really cool about the rumen microorganisms is that they're very adaptable. So when a cow is out eating a high forage diet, there's a subpopulation of those rumen microorganisms that flourish because that's the diet. That's what they like to eat. Now, as we move into a feedlot situation where we change from a more forage-based system into one that has more grain and more starch, there's a different subpopulation that's always present in small numbers in a forage-based diet that's going to flourish when they have that grain-based diet. And so that's something I think that you may hear from folks who are kind of activists against the feedlot industry, is that cattle did not evolve to eat grains. And while yes, cattle did evolve as grazers, certainly the rumen population is amazingly adaptable and can adapt within hours and days to a diet change like that. So yes, good question, but no, by and large, the bacteria, protozoa, and fungi are after the feedstuffs, not after the rumen lining itself.
Okay, this one dovetails really nicely with what you were just talking about as far as forage-based versus feedlot nutrition. But we had a question come in asking if methane production was higher for corn-fed versus grass-fed cattle.
Good question. No, methane production is highest in a forage-based system. So that actually runs a little counterintuitive and counterproductive to some of the anti-feedlot activists in the world who will try to tell you that that's a bad use of ecosystem nutrients. But no, forage-based diets actually produce more methane than do diets with more energy in them? Great question.
Okay, I'm just making sure we send some response here. I think that's run the course of our questions, Rachel. So,
Excellent.
yeah.
Yo, 2018-2019 SPC participants, these are the best webinar question and answer sessions ever. You're the best group ever. Keep it up. This is awesome.
Yeah, it's great.
All right. Well, with that then, we'll call it a night, and we'll be in touch. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And everybody stay warm out there, and have a great evening.
Thanks, everybody.